There is an amazing podcast called Beat Your Genes featuring Dr. Doug Lisle, who you see on the left in this image. And it's hosted by Nate G on the right. And these guys are discussing human behavior based on evolutionary psychology. And it's an amazing podcast. I love it. But as you listen to it, and I'm listening from the beginning, it becomes clear that these guys are hostile to communism and socialism. In fact, the most recent episode I was listening to, Dr. Lisle made a comment about how Marxist sociology professors are what he calls effectively stupid people. Like he was comparing them to people who think the paleo diet is a good way to eat. And I think what he was saying, he even said it doesn't mean they're actually not smart people, but he said, I think he was saying when some people are so wedded to an opinion that they're not reachable. Maybe they're stubborn. So, um, and honestly, a lot of he may even be right about this. A lot of the criticisms he expresses of socialism, I actually agree with. For reasons that I'm going to get into, I think the meaning of socialism in the United States, socialism has come to mean certain things that should be criticized, in my view. So I get where he's coming from on a lot of his criticisms. But in any case, yeah, I just hearing these things, it does prompt me to want to reply. And I don't know if I can get these guys to hear me out. But I maybe they are curious enough people to wonder what someone who disagrees might be thinking that's listening to the podcast. So I guess that's my hope. But I can understand, especially Dr. Lisle. He's a super smart guy that knows a lot about a lot of different subjects, including economics. So, and he talks often about how you only have so many hours left to live, and you have to decide how you want to spend your time. So um, I understand if he would think maybe someone that subscribes to socialist ideology maybe is not worth listening to. But anyway, I hope I can. Maybe he's curious enough that he would listen. So um, I want to start to just point out and say the idea that socialism is a failure, like in the Soviet Union, is not. Uh, this was not the belief of American planners during the existence of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was perceived as having achieved amazing things. Here, I stumbled on this. This is Donald Rumsfeld talking about the threat of the Soviet Union when he was Secretary of Defense under Ford.
I'm not saying with certainty that the Russians are coming. I'm saying the trends are here. I'm not saying the Russians are 10 feet tall. I'm saying they used to be 5'3". They're now 5'9.5", and they're growing.
Interesting phrase, because it's true that after the Bolshevik Revolution, that we have the data on the stature of Russians, because the caloric intake was improving so much that they did actually grow in stature a significant amount. This is I have a quote here from Fischer writing in the Nation. He's just talking about how in the 30s. So when there's a Great Depression, all over the world, it's not just affecting the United States. The Soviet Union is just what he calls an orgy of construction. It's like banks are failing, economies are crumbling, but the Soviet Union is just charging ahead. Like what's happening? This is shocking. This is 1983. There's a CIA report about how the Soviets are eating a diet that's they're at least matching or roughly matching American caloric intake, but their diet may be more nutritious. And so this is frustrating to American planners. And Reagan is quoted, is referred to in this article, as trying to figure out ways to upset them, and prevent them from succeeding, and then tightening embargoes. Like, what are we going to do to deal with these people? We're opposing them, aggressively. We're trying to engineer their failure. We're trying to draw them into war. Like Zbigniew Brzezinski was Carter's national security advisor, and after the Afghan war, he says I lured them into the Afghan trap. I mean, the idea is not, for them is not, oh, how can we help Afghans? The idea is we want to start a war just to bleed them. The Cold War, we want to siphon off their smartest people, their most capable people, and force them to focus on armaments development rather than making the lives of their people better. Like we're the most powerful country in the world. Um, the United States after World War II, it had 6% of the world's population, but half of the world's wealth, and used that organization to structure the world to try to maintain that position of power. And the threat is the Soviet Union. So why are we calling the Soviet Union a failure when they're the only country that had any realistic chance of threatening total global U.S. Domination? Um, they just they did ultimately fail, and I think this is an idea that's just taking root. And I found a quote in this book. Robert Wright quotes Marx and Engels to the effect of, the ideas of the age are ever the ideas of its ruling class. And I think the idea that the Soviet Union was a failure now, post after the Soviet Union, it's just taken root. It's useful. They want us to think, never try socialism because that doesn't work. But if you go back in time, you find that they knew it was working. I'll provide a link to Arthur Schlessinger was an advisor to President Kennedy, and he provided a report, Latin American report, um, as Kennedy entered office, and it says, we're getting unprecedented competition from the Soviet Union. They're presenting themselves as a model of successful modernization in a single generation, and they're flourishing large development loans, and this is stimulating people who want to take matters into their own hands and are interested in a decent living. It's stimulating them to follow that same path. So, um, of course, the Soviet Union did ultimately collapse. And so, in a sense, of course, it had failings, individual failings, and ultimately overall failed. But I don't think it doesn't make sense to call socialism a failure any more sense to call that a failure than it would to call capitalism a failure, just because capitalism, when it first emerged and was resisted by the feudal aristocracy, was sometimes beaten back and defeated. That doesn't make it a failed system, and it doesn't mean it doesn't have a lot of successes, and ultimately did succeed, just as socialism we expect will ultimately succeed. Just a couple points more about their success. That after the Bolshevik Revolution, 15 countries invaded the Soviet Union, including the United States, and the Soviet Union was able to defeat them. So that's an initial success, and then they proceeded to implement their program of they had a massive push for improved healthcare, and they saw massive gains in life expectancy. Uh, this professor here, this is Dr. Asatar Bear from Riverside City College. He says it is history's most rapid doubling of life expectancy. He talks about gains in stature. Um, they embarked on a literacy campaign immediately. They had 75% of the population illiterate at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, and eliminated illiteracy. They would eliminate homelessness. I talked about food. They would become the world's largest producer of steel, largest producer of tractors. Um, just one comment that Dr. Lisle indicated that only the free market could produce a personal computer. I think that's what he said. This is the personal computer released in the Soviet Union in 1984. And I would add that the United States, the free market did not produce by itself the personal computer. The computer research was funded by the United States government for decades, billions of dollars, and that's just not something the free market could ever do, because investors are looking at returns of their investment in a shorter time frame than what was required for the development of computers. Now, of course, the profiteers and private industry is involved, and this technology was handed off to private industry, and the profits are privatized, whereas the costs are borne by the taxpayer and the public sector. Um, but I'm not saying that private industry didn't contribute; they did. But the socialism was able to produce a computer, and in the United States, the internet, satellite communications, automation, commercial aviation. These are just modified bombers, lasers. It is all kinds of technological advancements. I would say the core technological advancements that make the United States the successful dynamic economy that it is are rooted in the government sector. So the United States is not a free market economy. And just to add to that, this is some of the U.S. military bases around the world. There's 800 U.S. military bases that are publicly disclosed, roughly, and there's probably hundreds more that are not publicly disclosed. The United States is not a free market country. The United States, as I mentioned, is seeks to organize the world to serve our own economic interest. So, these don't these exist for a reason. And the U.S. gets involved in the economies of other countries. Um, like for example, in Haiti, they elected a president in 1994 that caught the U.S. off guard. Basically, it was a priest from the slums, and they expected the World Bank official that was running against him to win, as because the U.S. is involved in these elections. And when Aristide won and started to threaten to undermine the U.S. economic program, he was removed in a coup and replaced with the World Bank official that was his opponent. Um, and I recall this WikiLeaks disclosure when Haiti was looking to increase their minimum wage. Levi Strauss and Haynes objected, and Obama intervenes to prevent them from getting a decent minimum wage. They wanted to go to 61 cents an hour, and Obama said, sorry, 31 cents is all we can offer you. And so that's where they ended up. The U.S. You probably know about the Chicago School economists who were involved in the Latin American countries organizing their economies. The United States to maintain those programs had to implement terror campaigns and murder campaigns. This is a CIA program of they were just hunting communists and leftists down and torturing and murdering them uh, because they didn't want to see their economic agenda that was implemented being undermined. This economic agenda is very useful for U.S. corporations. Basically, when you're on the top of the heap and you have the best technology, as the United States does and did at this time, you want free markets, right? Because you don't want you know you don't want other countries developing industry that can compete with your high value stuff. You say, hey, you should pursue your comparative advantage. You should just sit there and sew underwear together and sew pants together and work in sweatshops. And we will make the cars and we'll make the computers and we'll make all the stuff that that is high value for which high pay. And we're not going to allow you to block that because if you block that and there's demand within your own country for these products from your own industries, those industries will probably develop, which is, for instance, what has happened in places like Japan and South Korea. South Korea was permitted by the United States to uh, implement that program, and not at all a free market approach to economic development. They blocked imports, and they had severe penalties for people who would invest in companies outside of Korea, uh, including death. So, not a free market approach. Basically, a planned economy is what led to their development. Well, the United States didn't want that in Latin America, and so you have to implement a terror regime, and that's what the U.S. did. So this is not free market. Um, okay, let me just jump back to the Soviet Union. They invented space travel. They had a lot of technological advancements. I'm showing here an image from the surface of Venus. They had a soft landing on Venus and took images that were sent back to the Earth. That's how we're able to see the surface of Venus. They sent similarly to Mars. They had, this is a country that started as the poorest part of Europe. The countries that made up the Soviet Union were the poorest countries in Europe. These were among the poorest people in the world, sowing crops by hand. Um, they were able to industrialize faster than had ever been done before. And, I think the comparison that's made for socialism is they say, well, the Soviet Union wasn't as nice as the United States. That's not a reasonable comparison. The United States is the world's richest country, and the Soviet Union started as the poorest. We can't expect them to become socialist and, like a light switch, be better than any other country in the world. The key is to look at the progress they made, and they did make significant progress. Now, what you find is you'll say, okay, I know a guy, he lived in the Soviet Union, he came to the United States, and he says the Soviet Union is garbage. Well, of course, they were wiped out by the Second World War as well. They dealt with a lot of opposition. They dealt with the United States trying to undermine their economic progress, and they still made massive gains, but they didn't achieve U.S. levels. But that's not a reasonable comparison. You have to look at where they started and how much progress they made. And I just want to comment quickly on what I think is probably their most significant achievement, which is the defeat of the world's most powerful military. Um, Lebensraum, this is a concept the Germans had, living space. The idea for the Germans was to basically exterminate Slavic people, and the Soviet Union would be their colony. And Stalin was able to anticipate this and see it coming and industrialize faster than had ever been done before. And had he not done that, the Nazis would have won. I mean, Stalin was running around Western Europe trying to form a military alliance to stop Hitler, but uh, the Western powers were not interested, partly because they wanted Nazi Germany to destroy the Soviet Union, and partly because they did not believe the Soviet Union had any capacity to stop Hitler. And so, why join an alliance with such a backwards country that can't add value? You know, you're going to have to go. You know, Britain's going to have to go and fight to save the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union can't contribute to truth. And what ended up happening was the Soviet Union did far and away most of the heavy lifting that was needed to defeat the Nazis. I'll provide a link to this video. Dr. Lisle would probably enjoy it because it relies on some work from Steven Pinker. At the end, but the Soviet Union defeated as many, killed as many Germans in a single battle as the Western powers did combined. That was the Battle of Stalingrad, and of course they killed far more. So, if they did nothing else but prevent their own genocide, you know, it wouldn't make sense to call them a failure. Um, and then when capitalism came, run by the Chicago boys, life expectancy collapsed. For men, it's falling 4 years. You maybe remember Russian brides, you know, in the 90s. This is another article here about deprivation and suffering. I think their consumption for the median person might have fallen to about half the levels it was under the Soviet Union. The people were not at all happy. They would have, you know, wanted to retain the Soviet Union. There was a referendum at the time: should the Soviet Union be retained? Overwhelming support amongst the Soviet people. In 1996, if the United States had not intervened in their election, the communists would have won. And the United States, you know, just openly brags about, you know, intervening in their election to make sure that the private profiteers succeeded, and so they were able to do that. Um, it's a similar story in China. In China, again, you know, they're at the very depths of poverty. You know, Britain has fought 2 wars to compel opium addiction on China. So their life expectancy is in the toilet. And what happens after the revolution? They have gains in life expectancy that are among the most rapid and sustained increases in global history. Um, Here's a plot of economic growth, more or less during the Mao period: 600% growth. Um, you know, amazing growth for that period, and also for the, you know, in the post-Mao period. This is showing growth. This is GDP per capita growth rate. The number one country is China. Um, South Korea number two, and I mentioned how they were able to do that. I'd recommend Ha-Joon Chang's Bad Samaritans: The Myth of Free Trade and Secret History of Capitalism. He's a South Korean economist, um, and goes through, you know, how they managed to become wealthy. Like a lot of other countries, they did it with government planning and government intervention. Back in China, here's a Wall Street Journal article talking about their amazing infrastructure development. Um, they have brought 800 million people out of poverty in 40 years. Um, you know, there's a lot of talk about, I think Steven Pinker, in fact, likes to talk about how, look how amazing capitalism is. Look at all the people that have come out of poverty. But without China and their government uh, uh, directed war on poverty, the number of people in poverty in the world is increasing. Um, I mentioned, you know, their infrastructure. You know, it's interesting that in California in 2008, they passed a referendum to uh, build a high-speed rail between Los Angeles and San Francisco. Here we are 15 years later, and there's not much to show for it. In that time, China has laid 26,000 miles of high-speed rail, and it's amazing. Um, China is planting trees. I mean, they're you know, working on environmental issues. There are 66 billion trees in 40 years they planted to suck up carbon. Um, in terms of renewable energy. This is a plot showing the gains in their in their power generation from solar, and it's the same thing with hydraulic, wind, their nuclear pipeline. Just what's in development is as big as the rest of the world combined. So um, life is getting better super rapidly in China, and that's been continuous since um, the revolution. So how do we know also that China is the biggest threat to global, American control of the world. We know that the United States is engaging in economic warfare against China. We're banned from getting access to 5G technology from Huawei, which is basically superior. We're not going to be able to buy Chinese cars, which are approaching Tesla levels of quality, and you can expect that it's going to get better and better because planning works. The idea, I don't know what, I mean, I think people just, like I said, I guess it's Robert Wright. It's just this is beaten into our heads that socialism doesn't work. But I think if you just look, um, even superficially, it's clear that it does. Now, I want to talk for a minute about why we think socialism is such a failure. And there's a very important CIA program that started in the 50s called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And what it amounted to was the CIA decided to cultivate their own left in the United States. And this is where I get into a lot of the criticisms I hear from Dr. Lisle, I think are correct because the left in the United States is what is sometimes called a synthetic left. It's like a created left. Uh, they wanted a left that would call themselves socialist and yet be opposed to the Soviet Union because the United States recognized that the Soviet Union was a severe threat to our total world domination. Um, and so, yeah, what comes out of this is all kinds of stuff that socialists around the world and socialists like myself find ourselves opposed to, like just the idea that socialism for in the United States is often like I don't know, black bloc anarchists smashing windows and engaging in vandalism and spray painting walls and etc. Defund the police and your life is too good. You should live like a primitive with in a loincloth, running around the woods, and this is like noble, like a noble savage, and we should all have you shouldn't have such a nice house, you shouldn't have such a nice life. These kinds of things are obviously completely unappealing to the broad mass of the population, which is why the United States fosters this idea of leftism. You got Greta Thunberg. Interestingly, everyone should ride in a sailboat like me. When I travel, of course she only travels one way that way, and I don't know what the sailboat has to be shipped so that she can ride in it. I mean, it's silliness. The idea of Marxism is, we're going to use technology to make everyone's life better, including, addressing environmental problems, which China is doing. They're like, it's a real issue. Global warming is a real issue, but the solution is not let's deprive everybody. The solution is let's use technology to we can make. China is working on fusion energy aggressively. If they can develop fusion energy, we can use that energy to suck carbon out of the air um, and resolve the environmental problem without depriving everybody, and because people die from that deprivation as well. So there's a commentary about this Congress for Cultural Freedom that I'll also post in the description that I encourage you to check out. Um, there's also a lot of CIA involvement in U.S. media. So this is talking about an alleged major CIA operation to be involved in the media, and whether it's as large as is alleged, there's no doubt that it's significant, and that's discussed in this article. So they attribute atrocities to communists, and they get them published in papers, and so there's a lot of what we believe is just straight lies from the CIA. Um, I watched this. This is a documentary about the mass killings of communists in Indonesia, and in it, they're following a guy who they say is responsible for personally killing up to like 1,000 people himself, but he was involved in the organization of the mass killings, and they say, hey, um, can we get you to reenact what you did and how you killed people? And he perceives himself as like a gangster, like in like an American gangster movie, and so he's kind of a badass. So he agrees to do this, and he says we're there. They say we're making a movie, and so he's thinking of himself as I'm going to be portrayed like a tough guy, and so he's going through it. And as part of this, it was interesting to see he they would talk about videos that they would prepare and disseminate, and say the communists are, going to, here to kill you all, and they're going to kill you like this and like that. And he would say, in fact, we were killing people in the very manner we were killing communists in the very manner we were attributing to them, and but we had no evidence that they were doing this, but this is what we were doing to them, just murdering people and terrorizing people. And I think he says that this, that he has, American funding. I don't remember, it's been years since I saw this movie, but yeah, it's just we just lie. And it's obvious that US media lies against our official enemies. um, this is happening, even against Trump. Like, I'm not a fan of Trump, but you know Trump is obviously, the ruling class is hostile to him, and so they lie about him a lot. Um, this is a former CIA agent talking about some of these things. I'll put this in the video description as well. Just he would, they would just invent stuff, plant it in like a African newspaper. Then they would reach out to their contacts in U.S. media and say, hey, look at this Zambia Times article about the Cubans engaging in atrocities. Check it out, and then they would just publish it like stenographers. They don't really check stuff. And it's not just against socialist countries. The United States has other enemies. In this case, this was Iraq. Many people know that in the 90s, the U.S. wasn't, our politicians weren't immediately jumping on, let's go to war in Iraq. And so they brought out, excuse me, this girl who claimed that Iraqi soldiers were killing babies in hospitals. And it turned out she's here testifying at the Senate. And it turned out she was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador, and this whole thing was made up. But they just make stuff up, and attribute terrible things to our enemies, and use these lies to, it's propaganda to achieve whatever they want to achieve politically. We also, I think I showed, okay, so China has this war on poverty that I mentioned, and there was the documentary I showed. That was made in conjunction with PBS and aired a couple times in the US, and then had to be censored off of our televisions because it makes China look good. So we don't hear about the good things, and the bad things, I would say, are, sometimes are complete lies and sometimes exaggerated. And there were failings. Like I said, I'm not saying that they don't have any failings, but there's just a lot of lies and a lot of misinformation. Um, North Korea is a perfect example. I mean, we believe so many lies about North Korea. The irony is that we think they're gullible. We think they, believe crazy things. The very crazy things that we think they believe, these are invented or, made up whole cloth and foisted on American people. And so we are the ones who are the gullible ones. A lot of people don't know that if you're a North Korean citizen and you defect to the South and you provide information that supposedly helps South Korean security, they pay you a lot of money. And what this amounts to is, tell us terrible things about North Korea and you'll get a big fat paycheck. And you could tell us good things about North Korea, but there's a price. That price is prison. If you praise the North in South Korea, you go to prison. I'll put a link in the video description of a documentary, Loyal Citizens of Pyongyang and Seoul, and you'll hear from North Koreans now living in the South that, one guy, he was there, and he communicated his admiration for Kim Il Sung, and and discussed matters related to that, and went to prison for it. And there's plenty of cases of this. So, what kind of stories would we expect when you're going to be paid handsomely to tell tales, negative tales, and you're going to be thrown in prison if you tell positive things? what do we expect? Well, we expect exactly what we get. This is I'm going to show a video. Here's an interview on Rogan with Yeonmi Park, the world's most famous North Korean defector, and it's just silliness. The stuff that she says, like she's just figured out, the more outlandish. Now she's a fellow with the American Enterprise Institute. Making I don't know how much money. And she's figured out this is how you
The Joe Rogan Experience.
When you were talking about going to the doctor when you were a child, and that this is a very disturbing story, but I want you to try to explain it to people, how people were dying in these hospitals and rats would eat the eyeballs of the people who were dying, and children who were starving would eat the rats. And then the children would die and the rats would eat the children.
Yeah.
Explain what this was like, that you how did you see this?
Well, I mean, seeing that the bodies on the streets like everyday thing. It was
Yeah. How did you see this? I mean, that's a good question. I think she was 10 when she left, and she's in the hospitals watching this sequence of, it's just, she goes on and talking about all kinds of other just, nonsense. Like, she's talking about the trains, and, you get on the train, and, the train maybe goes once a month, or something like it. And it just, unexpectedly stops working because they don't have electricity, and the people have to get out and push the train as if people wouldn't just walk if the train stopped. I mean, are they pushing trains up hills in North Korea? It's a very mountainous country. It's just, and if you read the comments here, these people are, everyone thinks this is plausible. But so anyway, we obviously believe these terrible things. And I'm going to, another link. This is a really good, well done, short video called The Haircut, where two guys from Australia, you maybe heard, you got to get a haircut like Kim Jong-un or they'll kill you or something like that. It's just absurd. And they go and they get their haircut. But it's funny and well done. Just check it out. And they talk about a lot of these myths that we believe, and they show clips from U.S. media personalities propagating these ridiculous things. Now, like I said, that's not to say that, socialism hasn't had failings. Of course they have. In the Soviet Union, there was a famine in the 30s in Ukraine, and another in after the Second World War in 1947. And then in China, they had a famine also in the 60s. They called it the Great Famine. And these are obviously terrible things, and they were not able to organize and prevent these things from happening. But if you want famine, we don't have to go to the 30s to find death from deprivation deliberate as a result of capitalism. This is in 1996. Here's Madeleine Albright. We started out that war in Iraq, and then we imposed sanctions on Iraq, which is the idea is let's deprive them, and they suffer enough, and this is somehow going to cause them to overthrow their government. And she's asked about this in 1996.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
Right now, the world's worst hunger crisis is in Afghanistan, where the United States is deliberately depriving the Taliban of access to funds, their own funds, to cause suffering of the people. And it's causing starvation, and that's the point. So, yes, the Soviet Union had a famine in the 30s. They had constant famines before the Bolshevik Revolution. And the Soviet Union, the same thing happened in China, is they're driving towards industrialization because they are dealing with threats. The Soviet Union recognizes the Nazi threat is looming, and so they don't want everyone in the fields, sowing crops by hand. They want to mechanize agriculture and get people into factories so that they can repel the pending invasion, and that caused problems. And there ended up being, when they had weather conditions like had happened many, many times before, there was a famine. So that's terrible. And, they may have made choices, probably did make choices that were wrong. And nobody is saying, well, we should do exactly what they did. And, we should never, they learn from this, and they brought famines to an end, and the same thing happened in China. In China, it was the same story. They were dealing with external threats, and Mao is trying to get people into factories, and so he has um, been involved in some risky um, agricultural methods that ended up failing. Um, Other things happened that were mistakes. Of course, there was flooding and droughts. So it's not just that Mao like is trying to get all these people killed, um, but and he made choices that ended up being mistaken. And it's hard to know how many people who died as a result of those choices versus how many died from the weather conditions. But of course, China ended famine, and China did overall. I think overall they produced, like I said, one of the most rapid gains in life expectancy in world history. So I don't think it makes sense to capitalism has problems, right? You know, Britain in India, you know, was killing, people were dying from deprivation at a rate, about 100 million a decade. Okay. Now, I don't know if you'd call Britain technically capitalist when they first went into India. They were certainly capitalist for much of this period. And you're seeing as many people die in a decade as all the people who would die from communism if you accept the worst case estimates that you find in places like the Black Book of Communism. If you accept those over the entire period of communism in many, many different countries, um, Britain is matching that in India, a single country, and doing it every decade and repeating that for 170 years. So 17 decades. Capitalism, people are dying under a capitalist system as well, right? In the United States, we have a for-profit healthcare system, and people do die because they can't afford uh, to go get checked out sometimes. And it doesn't make sense, I think, to call capitalism a failure um, just because some people suffered under capitalism. You have to, and it's a lot. I mean, maybe you could call capitalism a failure, but the point is you have to take the benefits and the costs and compare them, and then decide if socialism is a failure. And I think when you do that, you find that it's not at all a failure. Um, Another comment on the famine in China. A lot of what we know about it comes from Nobel Prize winning economist Amartya Sen. And he explains that, yes, they had a great famine, but overall, in the entire period of Mao's rule, um, 4 million people per year more die in India because they did not adopt Maoist policies as compared to China. So that means, every decade it's another 40 million dead in India. And it's not that India is um, doing so terribly. I mean, they're seeing a lot of progress after 1947, but it's not at the rate that China is seeing progress. So fine, we accept that Mao made mistakes, and socialist governments make mistakes, and it's not that all socialisms are successful, but broadly, they are successful. That's the point, and I think the United States knows that, and that's why the United States is paranoid about China. You're going to hear all kinds of atrocity propaganda about China, just like we heard about from for all the other enemies of the United States, and but I think broadly and objectively, it's clear that socialism is not a failure.